Picture this. Seoul, Korea. The year is 1907, a city on the edge of collapse. Japanese forces have stripped the Korean emperor of his throne. The streets smell of fear and charcoal smoke. Churches that once held 100 people now hold 1,000, 2,000. People pressed against the walls, sitting on the floor, spilling out the doors into the cold night air. Something is moving through this city that no one can explain. And at the center of it, a man who should have been dead 3 times over. A man whose own father had cursed him, whose own body had betrayed him, who had traveled 10,000 miles looking for God and come home empty. His name was Kim Ik-doo. He was a farmer's son from the mudflats of Hwanghae Province. And on one particular evening in that January revival, he stood before 3,000 Koreans and wept so hard he could not speak. Not because he was special, but because the God he had nearly stopped believing in had just shown up. This is not a story about revival statistics. This is a story about what it cost to become a vessel. The years of shame, the decade of sickness, the moment everything broke open, and the transformation of a nation that no one saw coming. Kim Ik-doo was born in 1874 in a province where the soil was thin and the winters were long. His father, a man of rigid Confucian discipline, believed that the highest virtue a son could possess was obedience. Not the cheerful obedience of a willing heart. The silent, bowed-head obedience of someone who has learned not to speak unless spoken to. Ik-doo was the third of 5 sons. He was small for his age, frequently ill, and had a habit that drove his father to fury. He asked too many questions. Why do we bow to ancestors who cannot answer? Why does the village shaman's drum drive away spirits but not hunger? Why does the magistrate eat while the farmer starves? These were not safe questions in 1880s Korea. His father beat them out of him with a bamboo switch, or tried to. At 13, Ik-doo watched his younger sister die of cholera. The village shaman performed 3 days of ritual. Drums, rice cakes, incantations, the whole ceremony. His sister died anyway, feverish and small on the 3rd morning. His father wept in silence. His mother rocked back and forth and made no sound. Ik-doo felt something go cold inside him. Not grief exactly, more like the death of a specific kind of hope. The hope that anyone in the universe was listening. By 16, he was working the rice fields. By 18, he had a wife, an arranged match, a quiet woman named Soon-hee, whose eyes were kind, but whose life was already worn at the edges. They had almost nothing. A borrowed room, a single iron pot, winter coming with no stored grain. Ik-doo took a job as a laborer on the road crews the Japanese construction companies were running through the province. He carried stones. He dug drainage channels. He did not complain because complaining cost energy he did not have. Then at 22, his lungs betrayed him. It began as a cough that would not leave. By the 3rd month, there was blood. By the 6th month, the provincial doctor, a man who had studied briefly in Japan and carried himself with the authority of someone who had seen the inside of a real hospital, told Ik-doo that the tuberculosis was advanced. He gave him perhaps 2 years. He said this without looking up from his papers. Ik-doo walked home in the rain. He did not tell Soon-hee right away. He sat outside the door of their room and watched the water run down the street and thought about his sister and the shaman's drum and all the questions his father had beaten out of him, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not terror, relief. If there was no God, then there was nothing to be angry at. And if there was nothing to be angry at, he could at least die without the exhausting work of being bitter. That was the winter a Presbyterian missionary named William Blair came through the district. Ik-doo did not go to the meeting voluntarily. His neighbor, an older man who had converted the previous year, physically dragged him. "You're dying anyway," the neighbor said, with the blunt pragmatism of a man who grew up farming. "What do you lose by listening?" The meeting was in a borrowed schoolroom, 40 people, candles. Blair preached through a Korean interpreter, a young seminary student who translated it with an intensity that sometimes outpaced what Blair was actually saying. The message was simple to the point of being strange. God is not distant. God entered history. God is findable. Ik-doo sat in the back and did not respond. But he came back the next night, and the night after that. He did not get saved in a dramatic moment. It happened the way dawn happens. You cannot name the exact second the darkness ended. Somewhere in the 3rd week of those meetings, kneeling on a cold wooden floor at 5 in the morning, with 30 other people who were also coughing and desperate and not entirely sure this was real. Ik-do simply found himself believing. Not performing belief, not choosing to believe as an act of will, just believing. Like a man who has been holding his breath finally exhaling. He went home and told Soon-hee. She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "Does this mean you're going to start going to meetings at 5 in the morning?" He said yes. She nodded slowly in the way of a woman who has learned to absorb change without editorial comment. 3 weeks later, she started coming with him. His father, when he heard, said nothing for 2 full days. On the 3rd day he said, "You've brought shame on this family by abandoning the ancestors." Ik-do said, "Father, I am dying. I am not going to spend what time I have maintaining rituals that gave my sister no comfort when she needed it." His father's face went still. It was the longest speech Ik-do had ever made to him. His father did not speak to him for 6 months, but something strange was happening. Ik-do was not dying on schedule. The cough persisted. The blood did not stop immediately, but he did not decline the way the doctor had said he would. Months passed. He began to sleep better. The weight he had lost came back slowly. A year after the diagnosis, he walked 3 miles to church without stopping to rest. 2 years after the diagnosis, the provincial doctor, the same one with the papers, examined him again at Blair's insistence and sat back in his chair and said nothing for a long, uncomfortable moment. He could not explain what he was seeing. The disease appeared to be in remission. He wrote it down carefully in his notes. He did not say the word miracle because he had been trained in Japan, and miracle was not a category he kept in his clinical vocabulary. But he wrote, "Condition significantly improved. No adequate medical explanation at this time." Ik-do prayed over that sentence for a week. He began to study. Blair arranged for him to attend a small Bible training program in Pyongyang. Ik-do was 28, older than most of the students, slower in Greek, faster in everything else. He asked questions the teachers were not always prepared for, not hostile questions, hungry ones. What does it mean that the same Jesus who healed lepers is described as the same yesterday, today, and forever? Does that mean yesterday's miracles are today's miracles, or is that a figure of speech? The teachers gave careful answers. Ik-do wrote them down, and then prayed about them for hours in the dormitory at night, not satisfied but not stopped either. He returned to Hwanghae Province as a lay evangelist. No salary, no church building. He held meetings in homes, in barns, twice in a police station, after the sergeant on duty turned out to be curious. He walked. He walked everywhere because he could not afford a horse, and Korea's rural roads in 1902 were not built for wheels. He walked with a worn Bible and a small notebook of sermon outlines and a deep personal knowledge of what it was like to be dying with no one to call on. That knowledge was, it turned out, the most useful thing he possessed. Because he knew how to sit with a person who had been told there was no hope. He did not come in with the bright energy of a man for whom faith had been easy. He came in as a man who had been to the edge of the pit and looked in. When he sat across from a farmer's wife whose child had a fever that would not break, he did not quote scripture at her. He sat. He asked her to tell him about the child. He listened. And then he prayed with an intensity that people described later, consistently, across dozens of testimonies, as unlike anything they had experienced. Not loud, not performed, more like a man reporting to a commanding officer with complete confidence that the officer was listening. The first documented healing under his ministry happened in 1903. A man named Park, a rice merchant in his 40s, had been deaf in his left ear for 11 years following a violent fever. Ik-do prayed for him in the back room of a church elder's house, with 6 witnesses present. The man stood up, pressed his hand to his ear and began to weep. He could hear the sound of rain on the roof. He had not heard rain in 11 years. All 6 witnesses signed a written testimony at Blair's request. The testimony still exists in the Presbyterian Mission archives. Word spread the way word spreads in a province where everyone knows everyone and news travels faster than horses. Ik-do did not advertise, he did not want crowds. But the crowds came anyway. By 1904, he was holding meetings in fields because the rooms were too small. By 1905, Korean pastors from 3 other provinces had written to him asking him to come. He came. He always came. This was, people who knew him said, both his greatest strength and his greatest difficulty. Ik-do could not say no to suffering. His wife Soon-hee became expert at managing the impossible logistics of a man whose calendar was controlled entirely by whoever most recently appeared at their door in need. She did not complain. She organized. She packed his bag, kept the notebook of meeting invitations sorted by urgency, and raised their 2 children in a house that was frequently full of strangers who had traveled long distances hoping for a prayer. Then 1907 arrived. The Pyongyang revival of January 1907 is one of the most documented events in Korean Protestant history. What began as a series of scheduled prayer meetings for missionaries and Korean church leaders collapsed into something that no one had planned and no one knew how to stop. People began confessing sins publicly. Not small sins, decade-old sins. Hidden betrayals, acts of violence, thefts committed years before. Men stood up in the middle of services and named things they had done and asked to be forgiven. The weeping was so loud that speakers sometimes could not be heard over it. Ik-do was there, not as a featured speaker. He had been invited as one of several Korean evangelists, a face in a large gathering. But on the 4th night, the meeting's moderator, a missionary named Graham Lee, felt strongly that Ik-do should be given time at the front. Ik-do stood up, and for a long moment he said nothing, just stood there. The room went quiet in that particular way that happens when 3,000 people are all holding their breath at the same moment. Then he began to speak about his sister. He had never spoken about her publicly before. He spoke about the shaman's drum, and the 3 days of ceremony, and the morning she died anyway. He spoke about the cold thing that had settled in him at 13, the death of hope, the years of carrying stones and bleeding into rags, and being told by a doctor, who did not look up from his papers, that he had 2 years. He spoke about the neighbor who dragged him to a schoolroom meeting because, "You're dying anyway." He spoke about the floor of that schoolroom at 5 in the morning. He spoke about exhaling. He was not an eloquent man by classical standards. He did not have the training or the diction of the seminary-educated pastors on the platform. But by the time he had been speaking for 15 minutes, grown men in the front row were on their knees. Not because of what he was saying, because of what was in the room. People described it afterward in ways that were remarkably consistent across dozens of separate accounts. A heaviness, they said, but not oppressive. A weight that was somehow also light. Several people reported physical sensations, warmth in the chest, tingling in the hands, an overwhelming compulsion to get things right with God and with the people they had wronged. A man who had stolen money from his father-in-law 10 years earlier confessed it in front of everyone and offered to repay it on the spot. A church elder admitted he had falsified land records to cheat a poor family. He wept until he could not stand and had to be held up by 2 other men. A woman confessed that she had hated her mother-in-law with a violence she had never spoken out loud, and the mother-in-law who was in the room crossed the floor and held her. Ik-do watched all of this and wept. Not because he had caused it. He was clear about that consistently. In every account, he had not caused it. He said afterward to Blair, "I reported to the commanding officer. The rest was not my work." Blair wrote it down. After that night, everything changed and nothing slowed down. Over the next 3 years, Ik-do traveled the length of Korea in a way that was only possible for a man who no longer kept track of his own comfort. He preached in city churches and mountain villages and coastal fishing towns where the wind came off the sea and knocked the candles sideways. He prayed for the sick in numbers that are difficult to comprehend. The documented cases, the ones with named witnesses and written testimonies, run into the hundreds. A paralyzed woman in Wonsan walked out of a prayer meeting and carried her own mat home through the streets. 3 separate doctors examined her the following week at the insistence of the regional church council. All 3 wrote letters. None used the word miracle. All 3 used phrases like inexplicable recovery and no pathological basis for current condition. The letters are in the archive. A deaf-mute boy in Kaesong, 8 years old, present with his mother at an outdoor meeting, began to speak during the prayer time, not immediately after being prayed for. 20 minutes later, sitting in the back, he tugged his mother's sleeve and said, "Oma," the Korean word for mother. She had never heard his voice. She would tell the story for the rest of her life. A Japanese military officer attending one of Ik-do's meetings in 1909 in an unofficial capacity which was itself remarkable, given the political climate, left the meeting converted. He subsequently attempted to use his position to protect several Korean church gatherings from police interference. This created complications for him professionally that he accepted without apparent regret. He was baptized 6 months later, in a river outside Pyongyang by a Korean pastor, in full view of his own soldiers, who stood on the bank and did not know what to think. What people did not see was the machinery behind it. Ik-do woke each morning at 4. Not aspirationally, consistently across decades, regardless of how late the previous night had run. He prayed for 2 hours before eating, not with a list, with silence and then speech and then silence again. He had learned early that the noise of petition needed to be balanced by the discipline of listening, and that listening in prayer was harder than speaking and required more practice. He kept a small leather notebook in which he wrote, every morning, 1 sentence, what he believed God was telling him that day. Some of the entries were specific, some were a single word. The notebook survived him, his daughter kept it. He fasted regularly, not as performance but as discipline. The way a musician runs scales, not for the audience but for what it does to the hands. He fasted 1 day a week without fail, and several times a year undertook longer fasts of 3 to 7 days. During these periods he did not withdraw from ministry. He continued to travel and preach. People who were with him during fasting periods noted that he seemed more present, not less, sharper in attention, calmer in crisis, more likely to stop and notice the specific person in the back of the room who had not come forward and was trying not to be seen. He had a gift for noticing the person trying not to be seen. His family paid a price that families of men like this always pay. His son grew up in a house where the father was frequently absent and strangers were frequently present. The son carried a quiet resentment for years that he eventually resolved, in his 30s, in a manner that Ik-do did not live to see but that soon he witnessed with a particular kind of grateful exhaustion. His daughter became his archivist, his scheduler, his defender against the growing number of people who wanted pieces of him that he did not have to give. She was 13 when she began keeping records. She was still keeping records at 70. Soon he died in 1931. She had never been in good health. The winters of their early poverty had damaged her lungs in ways that never fully healed. And the decades of ministry travel, of hosting, of managing the logistics of a husband whose calendar belonged to everyone else had worn her quietly down. She died in their home, with Ik-do beside her, and their daughter in the doorway. Her last words, their daughter recorded, were practical. The correspondence from Manchuria is in the left drawer. Don't let him forget to answer it. Ik did not preach for 3 weeks after she died. He sat, he prayed. He did not perform grief and he did not rush through it. The people who wrote to him during those weeks received brief replies in a handwriting that was shakier than usual. He returned to ministry on a Tuesday, without announcement, in a small church outside Seoul, and preached for 2 hours on the passage from John, where Jesus stands at the tomb of Lazarus and weeps before he raises him. The congregation was 40 people. Several of them said afterward it was the most powerful thing they had ever heard him preach. He continued into his 70s. Age did not slow him in the way it slowed other men, though it changed him. The urgency of his early ministry, that driven, walking everywhere quality of a man who knows he might be running out of time, gave way to something slower and more deliberate. He listened more. He spoke less in the pulpit and more in the room afterward, one person at a time, sometimes for hours. Young Korean pastors traveled to sit with him, not to hear a sermon, but to be in a room with a man who had been at this for 50 years and had not lost the thread. He could tell them things that could not be taught in seminary. How to stay when everything in you wants to leave. How to pray when you cannot feel anything. How to hold a family together when the ministry is pulling you in 16 directions and your children are growing up in your peripheral vision. The work, he told a group of seminary students in 1938, will always be larger than you. This is not a problem. This is the design. The river is not smaller because it is larger than the bucket. The bucket still carries water. He passed from this life in 1950, in the weeks before the Korean War made his province a different kind of chaos. He was 76. He died at home, in the room where soon he had died 19 years earlier, with his daughter beside him, and a notebook on the table and a Bible that was so worn the cover had separated and been reattached with wire. He died not as a famous man. He was not famous in the way that American evangelists of the same era were famous. He had no radio program, no published autobiography, no photograph that circulated widely. What he left was not an institution. What he left was people. Hundreds of pastors who had sat with him, thousands of ordinary Koreans who had been prayed for and healed and converted and set back on their feet and sent home with something that held. Churches he had planted that are still meeting. A daughter who spent 30 years collecting written testimonies and organizing them into archives that sit now in the libraries of Korean theological seminaries, waiting for someone to read them carefully. The miracles took minutes. The prayer life that produced them took decades. The discipline that no one saw. The 4 o'clock mornings, the weekly fasts, the single sentence in the small leather notebook, the practice of silence before petition. That was the engine. The meetings and the healings and the revivals were not the story. They were the fruit of the story. The story was a man in a cold dormitory in Pyongyang at 2 in the morning, 28 years old, not satisfied with careful answers, writing hungry questions in the margins of a notebook, and then kneeling on a wooden floor and waiting for the commanding officer to respond. The same God who heard him then is listening now. The same Jesus who confirmed his word with signs through an unlettered farmer's son from Hwanghae Province is still confirming his word. The question that Ik-do asked as a dying 22-year-old in the rain outside his door is the same question every willing vessel eventually has to answer. Not can God use me? The miracle of his life is not the answer to that question. The miracle is that he asked a different question entirely. He asked, "Am I willing to pay what it costs to be used?" He paid. For 50 years he paid. In the mornings before the world was awake. In the weeks when nothing visible was happening. In the years when his family felt his absence like weather. In the moment he stood before 3,000 people in Seoul and spoke about his dead sister for the first time because something larger than his own comfort required it of him. The harvest he worked is still being eaten. What will you do with your one life?